let's just begin with a little heart meditation. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about core beliefs and trauma, because these are the things that EFT is about. As I said this morning, emotional freedom techniques, or EFT, can address the whole spectrum of human distress, everything from losing your keys to genocide to some of the things that we were working on this morning. But where EFT really works its magic is around addressing and dispelling core beliefs and trauma. Actually, I'll say traumatic experiences rather than trauma, because the word trauma is so loaded. And as I'm going to talk about in just a moment, there's trauma and there's trauma. But before I get into that, I want to invite you to think, if you can, look in your mind's eye at yourself as a newborn baby coming into this world. Just imagine, I mean, maybe some of you remember, but otherwise we have to imagine what it was like to come out of our mother's body and be in this world, and to just reflect on every single thing that we needed, every single thing that you needed. Absolutely everything had to come from somebody else. So whether you were hungry or needed a change out of wet clothing, or whether you were cold, or whether the noise in the room was too loud, somebody had to take care of that for you, for us, because we couldn't do it for ourselves. So what this means for us coming into our own seemingly independent personhood, that first year of our life was the ground on which we learned whether or not the world was safe, whether the world was trustworthy, whether we were safe, whether other people were safe. Okay? So the degree to which the people in our early lives could or could not decipher our signaling, because of course we didn't have language. So we did the absolute best we could to communicate our needs, And they did the absolute best they could to try to meet those needs. And sometimes there was a match, and sometimes it was a miss. All of that, from the point of view of EFT, is imprinted in us and still in us today. So I'm going to get into a little bit about brain, how the brain works. And some of you probably know this, that there are different levels of activity and awareness in the brain. The one that we're operating on right now, you're listening to me talking to you, I'm speaking to you, this is alpha level activity, right? Sort of the here and now. We go down a little deeper and we get into dream states, delta and theta. And these are the states, there are 5 actually, and I believe it's gamma that's underneath, and that one is like comatose, but otherwise, delta and theta, the lower cyclings, the lower vibrations, so to speak, are like dream states. And children, when we come into this world, the first 2 years of our lives, we are in theta. And then the subsequent 4 years of our lives, we're in delta. Which means that from ages 0 to 6, we are living literally in a dream world. And those of you who have young'uns know this. I see somebody here is nodding. But have you ever noticed with children, I lived in New York City for 5.5 years, and I used to ride the subways all the time, of course, because I lived in New York. And I just remember watching kids, how they stare. And of course the parents say, don't stare, you know. But they don't mean to be staring. But children are living in a dream state. Their capacities for cognition have not developed yet. So everything is operating on a subconscious level, and everything, absolutely everything is imprinting. Positive, negative, neutral, it's like a dumping ground, it's all just going in. And in fact, McDonald's, of all places, studied this. I mean, McDonald's has invested a lot of money into studying the psychology of children, the brains of children. They did a lot of research about the dreams of children, 2-year-olds. And they found that 2-year-olds, their dreams are largely populated with sort of shapeless, blurry, amorphous creatures with faces on them, not quite human. So think about Mayor McCheese and the Hamburglar and all those characters that McDonald's in McDonald's Land made up to directly communicate with the subconscious mind of children. And there are children who know Ronald McDonald and the McDonald's arches before they even know their own name. So our subconscious minds, especially in childhood, are very powerful. So what happens when our needs are not met? And I know a couple of you were saying today, like, well, I didn't have any really bad experiences in childhood. And, you know, this is where I want to say there's trauma and there's trauma. So there's like what we can call big capital T traumas, you know, big, heavy experiences of abuse that we can experience. But a trauma can also be something like a look that somebody gives us, or a word that somebody says. So the reason why those experiences can be traumatic is because, again, our minds imprint things directly. So to step out of the trauma world for a moment, I just want to give you an example of a child sitting at the dinner table, and the father at the dinner table is saying, someday our ship is going to come in. And what does that little child do? That little child goes to the driveway and goes to the window and waits for that big boat to come up in the driveway. The child's mind cannot discern, cannot differentiate it. When I was a little girl, my grandparents had a strawberry patch. And it was like a little strawberry patch that was there was a lawn in front of it, and then the patch of strawberries was right there. And as a little girl, I used to lie down on my side. I was probably about 4 years old, and I would just pick off the strawberries and eat them. And my grandfather said to me one time, you know, if you keep doing that, the tip of your nose is going to turn into a strawberry. And I remember thinking, I wonder how that's going to happen. I wonder how my nose could turn into a strawberry. There's no discernment. There's no filter of, the literal, the imaginative, the figurative. It is all just the realm of the imagination for a child. So what happens when we have stressful experiences in that 0 to 6 time? What happens in early life? So let's take an example. Something that I find with a lot of my clients is that they were put on diets when they were children. So let's just take Mary as an example. And Mary's mother, who, by the way, was otherwise a great mother, right? So again, no heavy capital T traumas. But Mary's mother said, you're a little fat, and we're going to put you on a diet. That is what we call a little t trauma. That's a traumatic moment. And what makes it traumatic is that there are 4 characteristics common to a traumatic experience. And this is from the work, believe it or not, of a doctor named Dr. Robert Scare, Dr. Scare, who studies trauma. I didn't make his name up. But there are 4 things that happen. Number 1 in a traumatic experience is that we tend to be shocked. Something happens outside of our habitual or our normal realm of experience, and we go into shock. Number 2 is that we experience it in isolation. So even though maybe there's 4 other kids sitting at the dinner table, when mom says, you need to go on a diet, you're getting a little overweight, the subjective experience of that young person is, I'm all alone. So there's shock, there's isolation, there's helplessness. There's nothing I can do about it. Now, I'll hit the pause button here for a second and say, a trauma, typically, we define trauma as any experience that activates the freeze response. So we've heard of fight or flight, right? We know about that. From an evolutionary point of view, if we're being chased by a tiger, we're going to run, or we're going to fight the tiger back. That's the basic impulse. But in the case of children can't fight because they don't have the capacity to fight. And children can't run because they're depending on their elders for survival. So no fight and no flight. So what's left is freeze. So what I'm talking about here when I talk about trauma is that moment of freezing when mom says, you really need to go on a diet because you're getting fat. And there's a sense of shock. What is contained in the freeze experience is shock, isolation, helplessness. And then the 4th characteristic is there's a threat to our identity. There's some way that our identity or our experience of the world gets upended. So for that little child, it might be something like, I thought mommy was my friend, but now she's telling me I'm fat, and so therefore mommy's not my friend anymore. Or more likely what happens with children, again, because in our child state, running on delta and theta, we don't have the capacity to say, well, she's probably wrong about that, or, maybe she's having a bad day. What we do instead, because children, we are inherently narcissistic as children, we make it about us. And we develop faulty cognitions. I am bad. She says, I'm fat, I'm fat. Somebody last night was saying, I wasn't fat in those pictures, right? Looking at pictures of ourselves, I wasn't fat. But the adult can look at the pictures and from a place of consciousness, from an alpha level say, oh, I wasn't fat. But the delta and the theta imprint are still, I'm fat. And even below I'm fat, there's something wrong with me. Because again, for the sake of survival, a child cannot make parents wrong. Because that would be part of the flight response. So when we go through these kinds of experiences, in order to survive the trauma, and I hope you know I hope you're getting a picture of what I mean by trauma now. So it's not necessarily like a tidal wave or a war. The trauma is a part of everyday life, really, from this point of view, right? What happens when we experience that is that in order to survive, in order to keep going, we have to disassociate from the experience. We have to somehow cut it off and push it aside. So that process of dissociation creates what we call a trauma capsule. And the trauma capsule, now bear with me here, what gets encapsulated in a traumatic memory? Number one is sense perceptions. I remember sitting at the table and eating peas and steak and the sight of the peas and the steak and the clank of the fork on the plate when Mom said I was fat and the look on her face and the smell of the food and this and that. It's like if you're in a car collision, if anybody's ever been, the smell of the burning rubber, the sound of the windshield shattering, the sight of the blood. We encapsulate our sense perceptions. That's one thing. The other thing that we encapsulate is emotions. I was mortified when she said I was fat in front of everybody else in the family. Or, I was terrified when whatever. So sense perceptions, emotions, and then the third is the cognitions that I was just talking about. And those are what we call core beliefs. I'm no good. I'm too fat. Mommy doesn't love me. Core beliefs, we know we've gotten to them when they show up in the language of a 0 to 6 year old. If a core belief is too sophisticated, it's not a core belief. it's our interpretation of it. But core beliefs are usually extremely simple, like I'm no good, I don't deserve, it's unsafe. And of course, I'm talking about negative core beliefs here. The positive core beliefs that we have, we don't have to deal with them because we already are those. So, EFT focuses on the negative, so this is what we're dealing with. So we have this traumatic experience. We have these 4 characteristics. We experience the shock and the isolation and the helplessness and the threat to our identity. We then split the whole experience off from ourselves and disassociate with it. But here's the thing. From the point of view of what we could call quantum reality, that experience never stops happening. When we dissociate from it, it goes into a perpetual play. In Tibetan Buddhist teachings, we talk about bardo, which is the intermediate state between birth and death. It basically, our experience goes into a kind of timeless bardo. From the point of view of how our consciousness works, it never stops happening. I don't know if I'm making any sense here, if you're resonating with this, but it looks like this. So let's say Mom says you really need to go on a diet and you're fat. Well, first of all, you might spend the rest of your life dieting, trying to diet. And even though you know it's crazy, the adult conscious mind knows it's crazy, but the subconscious is still saying, I should be going on a diet because the subconscious mind still has that child that is obeying mom by going on a diet. Do you see what I'm saying? So let's say the core belief is I'm not good enough. Let's say, mom said, well, you'll never amount to anything. You'll never be any good at anything. We then go into adulthood and we find bosses at work who never give us positive performance reviews. Or we get fired from one job after another after another. Do you see? And then we say, well, why? Why is this happening? And maybe we have enough awareness to say, oh, yeah, it's like when I was 5 years old and my mother said I would never be good enough. So we have the awareness, but on a certain level, awareness is the booby prize. Because we think, again, looking at this little piece of our conscious brain compared to the ocean of our subconscious, we think that we can figure it out from that little piece of consciousness. Oh yeah, it was like when I was 5 years old. And we sit in therapy and we talk about it for 10 years. But because we haven't gone back into the limbic system and into that amygdala, we still haven't really liberated that 5-year-old. The capsule of trauma does not change until we go back in and we open it up and we change the story and we create a new story. And that's the good news that emotional freedom techniques and other, not just EFT, but there are other modalities like this that we can go back. And you heard me saying this morning when we were doing some of our tapping demos, talking to that 7-year-old, talking to that young one, going back and talking to them and saying, this was not your fault, and there is nothing wrong with you. Mom was not well, and she didn't do this to hurt you. And then once that part of our brain gets this message, and then we can program it with a different experience, then we can finally let go of it and move on. And I just want to say, we can let go. It is possible. Somebody just gave a thumbs up to that. We actually can. It takes some courage because, as we saw this morning, initially you have to be willing to face, right? Initially you have to be willing to face that pain. And it's overwhelming, and it's terrifying, and we're not sure we can do it. But again, if you're held in a space with a practitioner, with a community, that fear and that anxiety and that panic can quickly give way to very, very fast liberation. There's something that I forgot to say here. Okay. This theory that Dr. Scare developed about trauma and the trauma capsule and how we dissociate from trauma and the trauma being in perpetual play, this is very much akin to what indigenous cultures really around the world realized for millennia. In an indigenous view, it's a slightly different language, but it's the same concept that when we undergo trauma, the indigenous view is that a piece of our soul splits off and goes into hiding. And in indigenous cultures, there's usually a shamanic practitioner who does what's called soul retrieval. I don't know if you've ever heard of this term before. But, we've all heard the term lost soul. So-and-so is a lost soul. Well, that's quite literally what we're talking about. It's someone who literally lost his soul, her soul, at some point, lost pieces of his soul, left them in various places, and then needs to be guided in terms of going back and finding those pieces and bringing them back. So what I'll leave you with, and then I want to do some more journaling and we'll do some tapping with each other, is that our behaviors with food are our best attempts of our own thinking and of our own resources. They are our best attempts to call our soul back home. They're our best attempts to find and soothe and heal those places of us, those parts of us that got lost through these negative experiences, through these false conceptions, through these misimprintings and misunderstandings. We're trying to find our way back home. And we try to do it through the food. And what you might have found, it works for a little while. And then it starts to boomerang back on us. But until we have really gone, I mean, the food, our behaviors with food really are like a call. You know, it's the part of us that's calling out for help. So until we really can deeply, completely, unconditionally love, accept, understand, be kind toward these parts of ourselves, and then begin to inquire, what are the roots of this? And open up those trauma capsules, change the experience, rewire our brains around those new experiences. Until that all is in place, all the dieting and all the exercising and all the this and that and all the this and that will just simply be more of the same. And this is why we keep trying and it doesn't work, and we keep trying and it doesn't work, and we keep trying and it doesn't work, because we haven't hit underneath. So I'm hoping that we can do at least a little bit of that this afternoon. And we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Okay, and I think that's all I want to say right now, and let's cut the camera and we can have some question and answers, and then we can do some more journaling. All right.